Now, let's see about various basic life processes. The human body has to perform various basic life processes for its survival. And these basic life processes can be categorized into three. They are communication, intake of raw materials and elimination of waste, protection and survival. These are the three different basic life processes which the body has to perform. Under communication, we have various transport systems, internal communication systems and external communication systems. The transport systems such as blood, cardiovascular system and lymphatic system, they ensure the supply of various requisites of the cells and tissues such as oxygen, nutrients to all the cells, and they also will ensure a removal of waste or unwanted substances from these cells such as carbon dioxide and other metabolites. So in this way, blood, cardiovascular system and lymphatic system, it regulates the various necessities to the cells. The next is internal communication. Within the cells or between the cells or between the organs or between the systems, there will be a communication so that all these things will be working in a harmony. And this is called as internal communication. Communication within the body, among the cells, among the tissues, among the organs and among the systems here. And for which the body has nervous system and endocrine system to facilitate such sort of internal communication. Other communication is external communication. Whereas in internal communication, we have seen the communication occurs within the body, whereas in external communication, the communication occurs with outside environment. So we are having various special senses to communicate with the outside world, such as we have eyes to see, ears to listen, a nose and skin for touch. In this way, the special senses will communicate with the outside world. The stimulus from the external environment is communicated into the body through this external communication by special senses. Whereas verbal communications or non-verbal communications, also a type of external communications through which humans can interact with the external environment. All these things, they come under communication. Transport systems, under which blood, cardiovascular system and lymphatic system. Internal communication involves nervous system and endocrine system. External communication involves special senses, verbal or non-verbal communication. The second basic life process is intake of raw materials and elimination of the waste. So, body requires energy, and this energy is supplied by the nutrients which are present in the food that is taken by the body. And these food consists of nutrients as raw materials, and body is involved in converting these raw materials to the nutrients so that they will be in their utilizable forms. This is regarding nutrients. Whereas body also requires oxygen, which is essential for various metabolic reactions, and this oxygen is also taken through a system called as respiratory system. In this way, the intake of raw materials are necessary for the survival of body. Intake of oxygen, intake of food is essential for the body. And the waste that is produced from the body has to be eliminated. And this is taken care by the excretory system. The food which is taken into the digestive tract is digested, absorbed, and the remaining unabsorbed substances will be eliminated as feces. Whereas the water which is absorbed is filtered and it is eliminated as urine through the urinary system. The oxygen which is utilized by the cells will lead to formation of carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide will be eliminated from the body through respiratory system. Hence, digestive system, urinary system and respiratory system are involved in intake of raw materials and elimination of the waste. The third basic life process is protection and survival. So, body should be protected from various external factors, and for which we are having skin, which acts as a barrier that prevents the entry of any substances, microorganisms into the body, or loss of any of the cell contents, interstitial fluid into the environment. Apart from this, body also requires defense from any microorganisms or any infectious agents. Here, body should develop resistance against these microorganisms and it should have immunity against these organisms. Body movement is also necessary for protection or survival, and it is mediated through muscular system and skeletal system. Whereas for the survival of the species, it is always essential for the humans to reproduce and transfer the characteristic genes to their offsprings. In the coming chapters, we will be dealing with them in detail. Under communication, we will be dealing with blood, cardiovascular system and lymphatic system. Whereas under intake of raw materials and elimination of waste, we will be dealing with digestive system, respiratory system and excretory system, that is urinary system. Whereas under protection and survival, we will be studying about skin, resistance and immunity, skeletal system, muscular system and reproductive system. Now let's discuss about another important phenomenon called as homeostasis. Homeostasis is nothing but maintenance of balance. Here in the body, a balanced environment has to be maintained internally, and this balanced environment will be maintained by various physiological processes which are involved in regulating the various aspects of body functions. So let us see what are various physiological variables which are to be maintained in a balanced state for the body to function in a very effective manner. They are core body temperature, water and electrolyte balance, pH, that is acidity or alkalinity of tissue fluids or cellular fluids, blood glucose levels, blood levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide and blood pressure. So these are the various physiological variables which are to be maintained in a balanced state in a respective limits for the body and the cells to function normally. And this homeostasis is maintained by control systems which function through positive feedback mechanisms or negative feedback mechanisms. Any control system has a detector, a control center and an effector. The detector will detect any changes that it observed and relays the information to the control center. And this control center will send the required input to the effector so that the observed changes are correct. For example, let's see the negative feedback mechanism which is involved in regulating the body temperature. There are various sensitive temperature sensing nerve endings which will detect the temperature within the body. For example, if there is a reduced body temperature, these nerve endings will be stimulated and they relay the information to the control center, that is a group of cells which are present in the hypothalamus. And this hypothalamus or the control center will send the signals to the effector organs, and the effector organs in this case are the muscles, which leads to excessive stimulation of muscles leading to shivering of muscles. Other effector is behavioral changes such as wearing a warm clothes to prevent the loss of heat and narrowing of blood vessels in the skin so that blood supply to the skin will be reduced, so body heat loss also will be reduced. And in all these cases, shivering of muscles, wearing a warm clothes or narrowing of blood vessels, all these things will lead to a rise in body temperature. Once there is a rise in body temperature, this will once again inhibit the process of stimulation of hypothalamus. If there is a rise in body temperature which followed by loss of body heat, and once again if there is a fall in body temperature, this once again stimulates this mechanism. In this way, the negative feedback mechanism will regulate the homeostasis of temperature within the body. We have seen that there are various systems within the body and all the systems work together for the process of life. And we also have seen that there are negative and positive feedback mechanisms which are involved in regulating the homeostatic balance. We have seen that there is a detector, a control center and an effector in the maintenance of homeostasis. And this communication between the detector to the effector, between the detector to the control center, and from the control center to the effector, it occurs through signals. And these signals between the cells, between the tissues or between the organs and between the systems is very essential for maintenance of this homeostasis and for the functioning of various cells. And now let's see how this signaling occurs between the cells, so which reflects between the systems or between the organs. Before going into cell signaling, we should discuss about an important component of the cell which is called as a receptor. Generally, receptors are nothing but they are proteins which are present either on the surface of the cell membrane or within the cell. And these receptors can be classified based upon their distribution. And based on the distribution, we can classify these receptors into two types, that they are either cell surface receptors or intracellular receptors. Cell surface receptors are the receptors which are present on the cell membrane, and intracellular receptors are the receptors which are present within the cell. And these receptors can be classified into 4 types based upon their signaling mechanism. Let's see them in detail. Generally, any receptor is an internal structure of the cell, and this structure or receptor, which is made up of protein chains, it binds with an signaling molecule, and this signaling molecule is called as ligand. And generally the ligands and the receptors are specific to each other. It means ligands are specific to few receptors and receptors are specific to few ligands. This works like an lock and key mechanisms. Every lock will have a particular key, and the lock will open when that correct key is used for that lock. In the same way, each receptor will have a ligand, and this ligands will activate that particular receptor. Now let's see what are the 4 different types of receptors which are classified based upon their transducers mechanisms. Transducer mechanism in the sense the way in which they send the signal or they convey the signal to the cell from the external factor.
Molecule, such as a protein, where a signal molecule can bind. One place you can find receptors is on the surface of a cell membrane. When a signal molecule binds the receptor, amazing things can happen. The receptor might start activating another molecule for an action to happen. The receptor often changes its shape slightly in the process. More about that later. So, receptor, signal molecules. The signal molecule can be considered a ligand, a fancy term which basically means that it's the smaller molecule that binds to a typically larger molecule. Signal molecules can be a variety of things, such as gas molecules or hydrophobic biomolecules like lipids or hydrophilic biomolecules like some kinds of proteins. But ligands are generally smaller than the receptors they bind. Ligands and receptors can have a very specific fit as well. Let's talk about the general sequence of cell signaling. First, reception. Typically, a signal molecule binds a receptor. Second, transduction. The receptor gets activated by this binding. This often means that the receptor will change its shape. It could even involve a whole series of molecules changing their conformation in something called a signal transduction pathway. This can amplify the original signal. Third, response. There's some kind of response that is going to happen. A portion of DNA that is found in the nucleus getting transcribed, for example, that's a type of response. Now, cell signaling can involve
the 4 types of receptor transducer mechanisms are: first one is ligand gated ion channels. Second one is G protein coupled receptors. Third one is enzyme linked receptors. And the fourth one are intracellular receptors. The first 3 types of receptors are cell surface receptors. It means they are present on the plasma membrane. They are ligand gated ion channel receptors, G protein coupled receptors, and enzyme linked receptors. Whereas the 4th type is intracellular receptors. Now let's see about these transducer mechanisms in detail. The ligand gated ion channel receptors are receptors which are linked with an ion channel, and that ligand or the signal molecule, when it binds to the binding site of this receptor, it leads to modification in the receptors which lead to opening of that particular ion channel, or which leads to closing of that particular ion channel which otherwise will always be open. In this way, the ion channels are regulated by these receptors, and these ion channels are necessary for the movement of ions into and out of the cell. We have seen that the cell membrane is charged and ionized molecules cannot cross this plasma membrane. And in such cases, these ion channels will be utilized by these ions to enter into the cell or to move out of the cell. These membrane proteins are also called as transmembrane proteins or transmembrane receptors because they extend from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane, and it has three components. The one which lies outside the membrane, it acts as a receiver for the signal molecule, or it is also called as ligand. So the ligand binding site will be present outside the cell membrane, whereas this amino acid chain or polypeptide chain will be extending throughout the membrane, and intracellularly it consists of the activation sites. And here we have seen when the ligand binds to this binding site which is present extracellularly, it leads to opening of the ion channel which allows the movement of the ions.
A ligand-gated ion channel. Ions normally don't go unassisted through the cell membrane. They are charged after all. See our cell transport video. But a ligand-gated ion channel gives them a way through a channel. But it is controlled. In this example, the channel is closed. But here comes a signal molecule, a ligand. It binds the receptor, which is the channel protein in this case. Now the channel protein responds by opening. The ions, not the ligand, go through. Once ions get through, the concentration of ions increases in the cell. And you may wonder, okay, so now there are ions in the cell. Why does that matter? Well, the increasing ion concentration can trigger a cellular response. After reaching a certain concentration and stimulating a cell response, the ligand can leave its binding site from the receptor and the channel can close. Ligand-gated ion channels can be used by neurons. A neurotransmitter may be the ligand for the channel to open. This could happen at a synapse. But just be aware that not all ion channels are ligand-gated ion channels. Ion channels can be gated by...
The second type of receptor is G-protein coupled receptor. In this, these receptors are coupled with specialized proteins called as G proteins, and these G proteins are bound to the intracellular site of this receptor, and whenever a ligand binds to this extracellular surface of the receptor, it leads to modulation in this polypeptide chains in the membrane, leading to activation of this G proteins which are bound to the intracellular site. This G protein that is bound intracellularly is GTP, that is guanosine triphosphate, and it is bound to an alpha, beta and gamma trimer, and whenever this is activated, the GTP is replaced with GDP by hydrolysis, and this GDP alpha subunit will mediate the receptor signaled action within the cell. And once this GDP alpha protein has transferred the signal within the cell, this is once again hydrolyzed into GTP, and this GTP alpha subunit once again it combines with the beta and gamma subunits, and this once again binds to the intracellular site and is ready for activation. And the third type of receptors are enzyme linked receptors, and these enzyme linked receptors are linked with an enzyme such as tyrosine kinase at the intracellular site. And generally, tyrosine kinase is an enzyme which is necessary for the phosphorylation of proteins, and this phosphorylation of proteins leads to their activation, and this is necessary for those proteins to perform their functions. And here, binding of the ligand at the extracellular site will lead to dimerization of the receptors. Here, dimerization is coupling of the receptors that are present adjacent to each other, and this leads to exchange of phosphate groups to the respective enzymes, which once again leads to phosphorylation of the proteins. The fourth type of receptors are intracellular receptors, and these intracellular receptors are present within the cytosol, and the ligand, which is hydrophobic, or we can say which can cross the cell membrane, will bind to this intracellular receptor which is present in the cytosol. And once this ligand receptor binding occurs, this leads to movement of this complex into the nucleus and activation of DNA binding sites. And once this complex moves into the nucleus, the activated DNA binding sites will adhere to an DNA, and they will cause stimulation of that particular gene, which once again leads to release of respective mRNA, which once again leads to release of or formation of those respective proteins. In this way, the intracellular receptors, which generally are the receptors for hormones such as estradiol, thyroid hormones, testosterone, they enter into the cell membrane, bind with the intracellular receptor, bind to the respective DNA, stimulate the respective gene to produce the mRNA, and this mRNA is utilized for the formation of respective deficient proteins.
Let's say we have a steroid hormone that travels through the cell's semi-permeable membrane. Remember, that would mean the steroid hormone is our signal molecule, our ligand. Once inside the cell, it binds to a protein receptor within the cell. Now, the protein receptor is active. The protein receptor travels into the nucleus where the cell's DNA is found. This protein receptor binds to DNA and is involved in getting transcription of a certain gene going, which eventually can be used to produce a specific protein. This is an example of signaling inside the cell, simplified a bit.
And this is the way the signals are transferred between the cells, between the organs, and between the systems. And now we have seen how the signals are transferred by receptors, and in the next class we will see about the various mechanisms through which these signals are transferred between the cells. Thank you.